At the dawn of the 20th century, an unfamiliar sound began echoing through American streets. It was not the steady rhythm of horseshoes against stone. It was not the bell of an electric streetcar or the whistle of a locomotive. It was an uneven mechanical explosion, metal shaking, gears grinding, engines coughing smoke into the air. The automobile had arrived. To modern Americans, driving is surrounded by rules. A person must study a manual, pass a written examination, practice under supervision, complete a road test, carry insurance in most states, register the vehicle, and obey an enormous system of signs, signals, lanes, and speed limits. But the first American motorists entered a very different world. Before statewide driver's licenses appeared in the early 1900s, a person who acquired an automobile could often begin driving without proving that he understood the machine, the road, or the danger he presented to everyone around him. There was usually no standardized examination, no official driving school, and no universal definition of what a competent driver should know. In practical terms, the machine itself was often the only test. If a person could start it, steer it, and somehow keep it moving, he could call himself a motorist. And even those three tasks were not simple. Early automobiles were unreliable, complicated, and physically demanding. Depending on the design, a driver might have to adjust fuel flow, control the spark timing, operate several levers, monitor oil and water, and manually crank the engine from outside the vehicle. A mistake while turning the crank could cause it to kick backward violently, sometimes breaking a wrist or an arm. There was no standardized arrangement of pedals and controls. One automobile might use a steering wheel, while another used a tiller resembling the handle of a small boat. The accelerator could be controlled by the hand. Braking systems varied widely. Gear arrangements changed from one manufacturer to another. Knowing how to operate one car did not guarantee that a person could operate another. Yet the law was moving much more slowly than the machines. In 1900, American streets were not designed for automobiles. They belonged to pedestrians, delivery wagons, bicycles, streetcars, carriages, and horses. In cities such as New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, these different forms of transportation moved through the same crowded spaces, with little separation. Historical records and photographs from the period show streets filled with pedestrians and horse-drawn vehicles, while early automobiles appeared as strange newcomers among them. There were few painted lanes. Stop signs did not yet form a national system. Electric traffic signals had not been installed. Drivers frequently relied on bells, horns, hand gestures, shouted warnings, and personal judgment. At an intersection, there was no universally accepted rule telling every traveler who should move first. The automobile also behaved differently from every other vehicle on the road. A horse could become frightened, but it could also sense an obstacle and refuse to advance. A carriage driver could pull the reins and depend partly on the animal's instinct. The automobile had no instinct. It obeyed only the person controlling it, even when that person was inexperienced, distracted, confused, or reckless. Horses were especially vulnerable to the new machines. The noise of an engine, the smell of gasoline, and the sudden appearance of a fast-moving automobile could cause an animal to panic. Horses bolted into sidewalks, overturned carriages, and threw passengers into the street. Motorists were frequently expected to slow down, stop, or shut off their engines when approaching nervous animals. Some Americans did not see the automobile as progress. They saw it as an invasion. Farmers complained that motorists frightened livestock and damaged rural roads. Pedestrians accused wealthy drivers of treating public streets as private racetracks. Carriage owners argued that automobiles were dangerous machines controlled by people who had never learned the customs of the road. The conflict was not simply between old technology and new technology. It was also a conflict between social classes. At first, automobiles were expensive luxuries. Many early drivers were wealthy businessmen, engineers, doctors, or hobbyists who could afford both the vehicle and the constant repairs it required. To working Americans watching from sidewalks or wagon seats, the motor car could appear to be an expensive toy whose owner expected everyone else to move out of the way. Motorists, meanwhile, believed they represented the future. They accused local governments of protecting outdated transportation and creating unreasonable restrictions. Each city responded differently. One town might demand that motorists slow to the speed of a walking horse. Another might require a bell, lantern, or warning device. A neighboring town might have almost no automobile regulation at all. A driver traveling between communities could pass through several different legal systems in a single afternoon. This patchwork made enforcement difficult. Police officers also faced a basic problem. Automobiles could move faster than most officers could pursue them. A motorist who ignored a command to stop might disappear before anyone could identify him. Cars did not initially carry standardized state-issued license plates, making it difficult to connect a reckless vehicle with its owner. New York began addressing that problem in 1901 by requiring owners to register their motor vehicles and display identifying initials on the back. Owners initially had to create those identifying marks themselves. The system was primitive, but it reflected an important change. Governments were beginning to recognize that automobiles could no longer remain anonymous machines. Speed soon became another source of anxiety. To people accustomed to horses, even 12 or 15 miles per hour could appear alarmingly fast. In 1901, Connecticut enacted an early statewide automobile law that set limits of 12 miles per hour in cities and 15 miles per hour outside them. The law also addressed the danger automobiles posed near horses, requiring motorists to slow or stop when necessary. But enforcement was uncertain. Many early automobiles did not have reliable speedometers. Police officers often estimated speed by watching a vehicle pass between 2 points. Motorists argued that accusations were inaccurate. Officers insisted that drivers were turning public roads into dangerous racing grounds. Behind every dispute stood a larger, unanswered question. Who was qualified to drive? Mechanical ability was not the same as responsibility. A person might understand an engine but ignore pedestrians. Another might drive cautiously but lack the strength to control a heavy vehicle. Someone could purchase a car in the morning and attempt to navigate a crowded street that same afternoon. There was no nationwide licensing system because traffic law remained largely a state and local responsibility, a structure that continues in the United States today. And in many places, there was no legal requirement that the driver carry any official document at all. The absence of a license did not mean the roads were completely lawless. Motorists could still be arrested for reckless behavior, excessive speed, property damage, or causing an accident. Cities could impose local rules, and vehicle owners might have to register their machines. But regulation usually focused on what a driver did after entering the street. It did not necessarily determine whether that person should have been allowed behind the controls in the first place. That distinction would become impossible to ignore as the number of automobiles increased. Every new motor car added another unpredictable machine to streets already crowded with horses, wagons, bicycles, streetcars, and people. Every accident raised the same uncomfortable questions. Should automobile ownership automatically grant the right to drive? Should age matter? Should the government examine motorists? Could reckless drivers lose that privilege? By 1903, several states were ready to take the first major step. Massachusetts and Missouri became early states to require driver's licenses. Yet these first licenses were far removed from the modern system. Applicants were not necessarily required to demonstrate their ability through a road test. In many cases, the document identified the motorist more than it proved competence. Formal driver examinations would arrive later and spread unevenly across the country. The license was therefore not the end of America's transportation crisis. It was the beginning of a much larger experiment. The nation had accepted the automobile before deciding who was qualified to control it. Now lawmakers would have to build an entire system of responsibility around a machine that was already transforming American life. And as the cars became faster, cheaper, and more numerous, simply knowing the driver's name would no longer be enough. By 1903, the automobile was no longer a mechanical curiosity seen only at exhibitions or outside the homes of wealthy enthusiasts. It was becoming part of everyday American life. The number of cars remained small compared with the millions that would later fill the nation's highways, but their presence was growing rapidly enough to alarm city officials, police departments, farmers, pedestrians, and horse owners. Each new automobile brought excitement, but it also brought another inexperienced driver into streets that had never been designed for motorized traffic. The central question was changing. Americans were no longer asking whether the automobile would survive. They were asking how society could survive the automobile. In Massachusetts and Missouri, lawmakers began requiring motorists to carry licenses in 1903. These early documents represented an important shift in the relationship between the driver and the state. Operating a motor vehicle was beginning to be treated not simply as a private decision, but as an activity that affected the safety of everyone using the public road. Yet the first licenses looked very different from the ones Americans carry today. A modern driver's license suggests that its owner has met certain minimum standards. The driver has usually studied traffic laws, passed a vision screening, completed a written examination, and demonstrated basic control of a vehicle during a road test. The earliest licensing systems did not always provide that assurance. In many cases, the applicant did not have to prove his ability by driving in front of an examiner. There might be no formal test of braking, steering, turning, parking, or reacting to traffic. The state was often recording the identity of the motorist rather than certifying his skill. A person could receive official permission to drive without ever demonstrating that he could do so safely. This may appear pointless by modern standards, but identification alone solved part of the problem. Before licensing and registration systems, a reckless motorist could cause an accident and escape without being easily traced. Once governments began recording the names of drivers and vehicle owners, responsibility became harder to avoid. The anonymous machine was slowly disappearing. Still, the United States did not create a single national licensing system. Each state developed its own rules, and the changes came unevenly. Some states acted relatively early. Others waited years, or even decades, before requiring every driver to obtain a license. This reflected the political structure of the country. Roads, traffic enforcement, and driver licensing were generally handled by state and local governments. A crowded industrial state in the Northeast might see the automobile as an urgent public danger. A largely rural state with few cars might consider licensing unnecessary government interference. As a result, American motorists entered a confusing legal landscape. A driver could be properly licensed in one state, cross a border, and encounter entirely different requirements. One community might enforce strict speed limits. Another might focus on vehicle registration. Some local governments required horns or lamps. Others demanded that drivers slow almost to a stop near horses. There were no national traffic signs guiding motorists from one region to another. Even common practices, such as which vehicle had the right of way, could depend on local custom rather than a clearly understood national rule. Police officers were forced to adapt. At first, many departments had little training in traffic control. Officers who had spent their careers managing pedestrians, wagons, streetcars, and public disturbances now had to confront machines capable of traveling faster than a horse and disappearing beyond the city limits. Catching a speeding motorist could be difficult. Some communities stationed officers along popular routes. Others used bicycles, motorcycles, or automobiles to pursue offenders. Speed traps appeared as police measured how long a car took to travel between two known points. Drivers complained that these methods were unfair. Motorists argued that officers were guessing their speed or targeting automobile owners simply because they were easy sources of fines. Automobile clubs began defending drivers in court and campaigning against what they considered unreasonable laws. The conflict revealed a growing political divide. To supporters of regulation, motorists were operating dangerous machines in public spaces and needed strict supervision. To many automobile owners, licensing and speed laws threatened a new form of personal freedom. The road had always symbolized movement in America. It connected farms to towns, workers to jobs, and families to distant communities. The automobile promised to make that freedom faster and more individual. Unlike a railroad passenger, the driver did not have to follow a company schedule. Unlike the owner of a horse, he did not need to feed and shelter an animal. He could leave when he wanted and travel where the road allowed. For this reason, some Americans viewed government regulation with suspicion. They feared that licenses, fees, inspections, and local restrictions would turn driving into a privilege available only to the wealthy or politically connected. Others believed the opposite. They argued that wealth already protected reckless motorists. A prosperous driver could purchase a powerful machine, pay a fine, repair the damage, and continue driving. Pedestrians and working families carried the consequences. Newspapers reported collisions involving children, workers, bicyclists, wagons, and streetcars. These reports helped transform traffic accidents from private tragedies into public issues. When a motorist injured someone, the debate extended beyond the individual driver. Critics questioned the entire culture of speed that the automobile seemed to represent. The language used to describe motorists reflected this anger. Reckless drivers were sometimes portrayed as speed-obsessed elites who treated public streets as racetracks. The automobile itself was described as a threatening machine that frightened horses, endangered pedestrians, and rewarded impatience. But blame was not always simple. Many early accidents occurred because the entire road environment was unprepared. Pedestrians crossed wherever they wished because streets had traditionally belonged to everyone. Children played near traffic. Horses reacted unpredictably to engines. Roads became muddy, dusty, or dangerously uneven depending on the weather. Automobile brakes were primitive. Tires failed. Steering mechanisms broke. Engines stalled in intersections. Headlamps were weak, making nighttime travel especially dangerous. Even a careful driver could lose control because of mechanical failure or poor road conditions. This complicated the debate over licensing. What should a driver be required to know? Should he understand the engine well enough to repair it? Should he be tested on local ordinances? Should he prove that he could control a car around horses? Should there be a minimum age? Should women be allowed to receive licenses under the same conditions as men? Should the state refuse applicants with poor eyesight or physical limitations? There were no easy answers because the automobile itself was still evolving. A test designed for one model might be useless for another. Controls had not yet become standardized. Some vehicles used steam, others electricity, and a growing number relied on gasoline. Drivers needed different knowledge depending on the machine they owned. Nevertheless, the basic idea behind licensing continued to gain support. The public road was shared space. A motorist's freedom could not be separated from the danger imposed on everyone else. Automobile organizations gradually recognized that reasonable regulation could protect the reputation of responsible drivers. If reckless operators were removed from the road, public hostility toward the automobile might decrease. Standardized rules could also make travel easier by replacing hundreds of contradictory local ordinances. The industry itself had reasons to support order. Automobile manufacturers wanted more Americans to buy cars. But families would hesitate to embrace motoring if roads remained chaotic and accidents dominated newspaper coverage. The future of the automobile depended not only on better engines and lower prices, but also on convincing the public that driving could become safe, predictable, and respectable. Licensing was one piece of that transformation. Registration identified the vehicle. A license identified the driver. Traffic laws defined unacceptable behavior. But a major weakness remained. The state could issue a license without knowing whether the applicant could actually drive. That weakness became more serious as automobiles became cheaper and easier to operate. The early motorist had often been a mechanic, engineer, or dedicated hobbyist. As mass production expanded, ordinary Americans with little mechanical experience began purchasing cars. The machine was leaving the world of specialists. Soon, the country would need more than names written in government records. It would need examinations, age requirements, road signs, traffic signals, and a shared understanding of how millions of strangers could use the same streets without destroying one another. The first licenses had established that the government could regulate the driver. The next question was whether the government could determine who deserved to drive at all. By the second decade of the 20th century, America's experiment with the automobile had escaped the control of inventors, wealthy hobbyists, and local officials. The motor car was becoming a mass-market machine. Factories were producing vehicles faster, prices were falling, and Americans who had once watched automobiles from sidewalks were beginning to imagine owning one themselves. The car promised access to jobs, distant relatives, rural communities, shops, and places that railroads did not conveniently reach. It was transforming daily life across the United States, not only in crowded cities but also in small towns and farming regions. But mass ownership created a problem that the first licensing laws had not solved. A government document could identify a driver. It could record an address, collect a fee, and establish that the motorist had received legal permission to use the road. It could not automatically prove that the person knew how to drive. The difference between permission and competence became increasingly important as more inexperienced Americans purchased automobiles. Early enthusiasts had often learned through mechanical experimentation. They understood engines because breakdowns were part of almost every journey. The next generation of motorists did not necessarily want to become mechanics. They wanted to turn a key, travel to work, visit family, and return home safely. Driving was becoming ordinary. The consequences of bad driving were becoming ordinary as well. Collisions were no longer rare incidents involving unusual machines. They became recurring features of American newspapers and city life. Pedestrians, bicyclists, children, streetcar passengers, wagon drivers, and motorists were all competing for space. A mistake at an intersection could injure several people before anyone fully understood what had happened. Licensing systems expanded, but they did so unevenly. Massachusetts had adopted an early driver license law in 1903, yet the state did not establish a general examination requirement until 1920. It introduced an earlier examination for professional chauffeurs in 1907, reflecting the belief that someone paid to carry passengers should meet a higher standard than an ordinary owner. Missouri also had a licensing law in 1903, but its general examination requirement came much later, in 1952. These dates reveal how slowly the modern driver's license emerged. The transformation did not happen in a single year. There was no moment in 1903 when every American motorist suddenly entered a licensing office, completed an examination, and drove away under nationally standardized rules. Instead, each state followed its own timetable. Some required licenses while asking little proof of skill. Others began examining professional drivers before applying similar rules to the wider public. Several states waited until the 1920s or 1930s to adopt comprehensive licensing laws. Wyoming did not establish its first statewide licensing law until 1947. South Dakota waited until 1954 and did not require examinations until 1959. For decades, two Americans living in different states could face completely different expectations before legally operating a car. One might have to answer questions, demonstrate control of the vehicle, and meet age requirements. Another might only have to submit an application and pay a fee. A third might live in a place where no statewide driver's license was required at all. The American licensing system reflected the country itself, divided among states, shaped by local politics, and resistant to sudden national control. Traffic regulation remained primarily a state responsibility, allowing governments to respond to their own road conditions, but also producing a confusing collection of laws. Meanwhile, cities were trying to impose order on the physical streets. In 1914, Cleveland installed an early electric traffic signal. It represented an important change in traffic management. Instead of depending entirely on police officers, shouted instructions, or uncertain negotiation between drivers, a mechanical signal could tell entire streams of traffic when to stop and when to move. But traffic signals alone could not create safe drivers. Americans also needed common signs, road markings, and rules that could be understood beyond the boundaries of a single town. Automobile clubs had already begun placing their own signs along important routes around the turn of the century. Later, more organized efforts produced manuals for rural highway signs in 1927 and urban traffic devices in 1930. These developments gradually moved the country toward a more uniform visual language of driving. A red light would eventually mean the same thing whether the driver lived in Ohio, California, or Massachusetts. A warning sign would communicate danger without requiring a local officer to explain it. Painted lines would divide opposing traffic. Intersections would become regulated spaces rather than public negotiations conducted through horns, gestures, courage, and luck. At the same time, the driver's examination began evolving. New York required all motor vehicle operators statewide to obtain licenses in 1924. In 1925, it introduced a system described in state historical records as driver testing in a form recognizable to modern motorists. Applicants could increasingly be expected to show that they understood traffic law and could control an automobile, rather than merely provide their names to the government. The examination changed the meaning of the license. The document was no longer simply evidence that a person had paid for permission. It was becoming evidence that the person had met a minimum standard. Written questions could test knowledge of speed limits, signals, intersections, and right-of-way rules. Vision screening could reveal whether an applicant could see dangers ahead. A practical test could expose someone who understood the law on paper but could not steer, brake, reverse, or respond calmly in traffic. The process was imperfect. Tests varied from state to state. Some were brief. Some were easy to pass. Examiners could apply standards inconsistently. Rural motorists faced different conditions from city drivers, and early licensing offices did not always have enough employees, vehicles, or facilities to examine every applicant thoroughly. But the principle was revolutionary. For the first time, the state was not merely reacting after a driver caused harm. It was attempting to prevent an unqualified person from entering the road. Driver education developed alongside these examinations. Early programs appeared between approximately 1910 and 1920, although formal courses became more established during the 1930s. Schools, private instructors, automobile clubs, and safety organizations began teaching young Americans that driving was a learned responsibility rather than a skill acquired through reckless experimentation. The culture surrounding the automobile was also changing. During the earliest years, bravery and mechanical confidence had often been treated as enough. A successful motorist was someone who could start a difficult engine, repair a broken chain, cross a muddy road, and continue after a mechanical failure. The modern driver needed a different form of discipline. He or she had to anticipate the actions of strangers. The driver had to accept limits, yield the right-of-way, observe signals, control speed, protect pedestrians, and understand that public roads were shared environments. This change also altered the meaning of freedom. The automobile had originally represented independence from railroad schedules, streetcar routes, and the physical limits of the horse. Regulation appeared to restrict that independence. A license could be denied, suspended, or revoked. A driver who violated the rules could lose the ability to operate a vehicle legally. Yet regulation also made widespread automotive freedom possible. Without predictable traffic rules, millions of cars could not have safely shared American roads. Without registration, dangerous drivers could remain anonymous. Without licenses, governments had little ability to identify, examine, discipline, or remove motorists who repeatedly endangered others. The system did not destroy automotive freedom. It created the structure that allowed that freedom to expand. So, before driver's licenses existed, could anyone in America simply drive? In many communities, the legal answer was remarkably close to yes. A person who owned or borrowed an automobile might enter a public street without completing a road test, carrying a license, studying a driver's manual, or receiving professional instruction. Local speed laws and reckless driving rules might still apply, but the government often did not examine the person before the journey began. The practical answer, however, was more complicated. Early automobiles were difficult machines operating in dangerous environments. A driver needed courage, mechanical knowledge, physical control, and considerable luck. The absence of licensing did not make driving easy. It made every road user part of the experiment. The year 1903 was therefore not the moment when America completed the modern licensing system. It was the moment when several states began accepting a new idea. Operating a motor vehicle on a public road was not merely a private act. It was a public responsibility. Over the following decades, licenses, examinations, traffic signals, road markings, age requirements, driver education, and standardized signs would gradually create the system Americans recognize today. The automobile had arrived before the rules. America spent more than half a century trying to catch up.